A speeding car crashed and exploded at the Canada-U.S. border in Niagara Falls today. 2 people were found dead at the scene. Eyewitnesses reported seeing an accelerating car that swerved to avoid another vehicle before hitting a curb, launching it into a U.S. Customs and Border Protection booth. New York's governor says the investigation is ongoing, but at the moment, there's no evidence to indicate any terrorist activity.
And then all of a sudden he went up in the air, and then it was a ball of fire like 30, 40 feet high. I've never seen anything like it.
2 people were found dead in a vehicle that exploded at a Canada-U.S. border crossing bridge in Niagara Falls today.
There are a lot of questions, and we are following up to try and get as many answers as rapidly as possible. We are in close contact with U.S. officials, and we'll continue to work closely with them.
The vehicle suddenly crashed and exploded on the U.S. side of the Rainbow Bridge just before noon, triggering a lockdown along the border at 4 separate entry points between Canada and New York State.
So we were walking up the road, and we seen this car coming down towards the border, and he was flying over 100 miles an hour. There was a car in front of him. He swerved out, went in front of the car, hit the fence, went flying up into the air.
Videos posted to social media showed smoke and flames and the wreckage of at least 1 vehicle at the secondary checkpoint complex. 1 border agent was injured but has since been released from hospital.
Well, obviously, any time a piece of infrastructure as important to Canada and the United States, like a border crossing, sees this kind of violent circumstance, it's a source of concern for the government of Canada and for the United States.
New York Governor Kathy Hochul now saying there is currently no indication the incident was a terrorist attack.
Based on what we know at this moment, and again, anything can change, there is no sign of terrorist activity with respect to this crash.
And about 30 feet from me, I seen something airborne. I first thought it was an airplane. It looked like slow motion. And I said, my God, it's a car. And it's a vehicle, and it's flying through the air.
We're not aware of any threats to this area, but I state the caveat that the investigation is ongoing. If you can imagine, this vehicle basically incinerated. Nothing is left but the engine. The pieces are scattered over 13, 14 booths. So it is a large scene, and it's going to take a lot of time for our federal law enforcement partners to be able to piece together the real story.
For more on this, we're joined by Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting and former Senior Strategic Analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Phil, New York's governor currently says preliminary investigations say there's no known terrorist connection, but there's still a lot up in the air. What does this situation look like to you?
I think there are just so many questions right now. But I would just simply say that given the amount of sensitivities in the world, especially over Gaza and Israel, not to mention Ukraine and Russia, not to mention the upcoming U.S. elections, there's so many variables up in the air as to what, if this in fact were intentional. And that's a big, big if right now. It could be accidental. It could just been a terrible occurrence that had nothing to do with violent extremism. So I think at this point, it's simply way too early to rule definitively on what this was or what it wasn't.
What are the next steps for investigators? Can you walk us through what happens behind the scenes?
Sure. So the FBI, local law enforcement, and what's called the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the United States, will be going through any kind of surveillance footage. So there's probably cameras being at border posts. They'll try to figure out which car this was, perhaps get the license plate on the car before it blew up, what direction it was traveling in. Was it doing some kind of surveillance in the lead up to the actual explosion itself? Was it driving the wrong way? Did it speed up? If they do get an indication as to the vehicle's information, they could get an owner. Then they could determine who's the owner. Is he known to police or law enforcement or security services in the United States? So you're uncovering, it's like an onion, right? It's layer by layer by layer. And the more information that you can definitively identify, that leads to some answers to questions, but leads to more questions. So I have a lot of faith in the FBI and their counterparts in the States. I worked alongside, people in the FBI when I was with CSIS. So I think they're going to do their job. But it's a slow process. And I understand the news cycle. I've been doing interviews like this for almost a decade now. We all want to know more rather than less, sooner rather than later. But we're going to have to give them time to do a thorough investigation. The last thing we want is people to panic.
How unprecedented is an explosion on the Canada-U.S. border?
Well, I'll walk your viewers back to 1999. Ahmed Rassam was a Canadian jihadi who tried to cross the border from BC into Washington State with a trunk full of explosives. He was on his way to Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. He was a so-called Millennium Bomber, and he was an Al-Qaeda affiliated individual who wanted to terror attack the United States to coincide with the onset of the new millennium. So it's not unheard of. We saw the border incident in Coos, Alberta, during the so-called Freedom Convoy a couple of years ago. If you are a person that has nefarious intent in mind, the border is a great place to target, because just think of what the border means for our two countries. I mean, I still think that the cross-border trade between Canada and the United States is, if not the number one economic relationship in the world, it's pretty high up there. And both nations rely critically on the free flow of traffic between our two countries. So if you're trying to make a point, the border is a great place to make it.
That's former CSIS analyst Phil Gurski. Phil, thanks for speaking with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.